The coffee had gone cold before either of them touched it. Mark sat at the kitchen table, gripping the mug as if he were holding something that had already lost its significance. He was in civilian clothes, a simple gray shirt, no ranks, no insignias, nothing that could tell a stranger who he was. It didn't help. He looked like a general in the same way a locked door looks like wood. The form was correct, but the substance beneath it was something entirely different. Ilya sat opposite him with 3 folders spread open, a pen behind each ear, and a 4th in his hand that he clicked aimlessly, unaware of the sound. His notes filled every margin. Russian on one page, the Keti alphabet on the next. On the third was something in between, resembling shorthand, but it was a personal system of notation he had developed at 22 because no existing system moved quickly enough for his brain. The kitchen smelled of burnt toast that neither of them had eaten. "They will listen," Ilya said. He didn't look up from the folder. He said it like a man repeating something he had been telling himself for weeks, dulled, having lost its shine. But the conviction was still solid beneath the surface, like bone under skin. Mark looked at him. "They won't. Then I will make them." Mark lifted his cold mug and took a sip. 28 years of field tents and command posts had simply trained him not to care about temperature. His body had reclassified it just like so many other things. It hadn't disappeared. It had just been moved somewhere where it didn't interfere with the work. Ilya looked up. For a moment, they were just 2 men in a kitchen, so similar in face that strangers would stop mid-sentence, trying to understand what they were seeing. The same jaw, the same dark eyes, the same stillness that looked like patience but was something weightier than patience. A decision made long ago about what the world would see and what it wouldn't. "I need you to do nothing," Ilya said. "I am doing nothing. I need you to continue doing nothing. Whatever happens." Mark set the mug down, aligning it with the edge of the table. Precise. Just like how he laid everything out. "Ilya, whatever happens." The words escaped like a door closing from the inside. Quietly. Finally. Mark didn't answer. He looked at the folders, at the Keti alphabet in the margins. He had all the words his brother had learned, so that other people might not be afraid of anything. Ilya left with his folders tucked under his arm. Mark watched him go. Silence remained in the kitchen. The coffee stayed cold. Outside the window, the city moved, as cities always move indifferently, brightly, completely unaware that 2 people had just said everything they could possibly say to each other for a very long time. 6 weeks later, Ilya arrived at the station adjacent to Keti Prime on a diplomatic transport that smelled of recycled air and something remotely metallic that no filtration system could ever fully eliminate. The station was large enough to swallow a city without noticing. Its corridors were the color of deep water at night, lit from below by panels pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. In his research, he had read that this was the biological equivalent of background noise for the Keti, something between music and breathing. He found it soothing. He suspected that was not the intention. He was given a translator, a small gray device that sat behind his left ear. He was given a room, a sleeping space, a seating space, a bare wall, nothing more. And he was told that the High Council would receive him in the morning. He wasn't given water. He sat in the room for 14 hours. He didn't ask for water. Instead, he opened his notes and worked through the Keti speech patterns, the ones that didn't translate cleanly because they weren't built on the same logic as human language. The Keti communicated in layers. What something meant on the surface rarely corresponded to what it meant beneath it. He understood that. It wasn't so different from humans. In the margins of the last page, in handwriting no one was ever supposed to read, he wrote, "Mark would have already counted the exits." He put his pen down. He looked at the room. 3 exits. The northeast corridor, unmonitored after 2, according to station time if his reading of their rotation schedule was correct. He had noted that too. He wasn't sure why. Morning came by station time. An escort of 2 Keti arrived, tall, segmented. Their skin changed color slowly, which signified a formal register. They led him through corridors that became wider and brighter until he stepped into a chamber built with one purpose, to force anyone standing in the center to realize exactly how small they were. It worked. The chamber was circular, with the High Council sitting in a raised row along the outer edge, 12 of them in deep red robes the color of old power. The first voice sat above them all. The color of his skin was perfectly still. In Keti body language, as Ilya knew, a very still color meant control. Whatever the first voice felt, he decided you wouldn't see it. Ilya stood in the center. No chair, no table, no surface for his folders. His notes were useless, and his hands were just hands, hanging loosely at his sides. He began. He spoke in Keti, in the formal register with the correct tonal layers. He felt the room change slightly, not physically, just a shift in the air. The 12 creatures raised their expectations because they didn't think he would speak their language, and they didn't think he would speak it like that, not perfectly, but sincerely. The way a person speaks a language they learned because they truly cared about those who had spoken it from birth. He spoke of the disputed corridors. He spoke of resource reviews. He spoke of territorial expansion, carefully, never saying invasion, carefully saying expansion, carefully presenting it as something that happened rather than something that was done intentionally, because his job wasn't to be right. His job was to find the door. For 40 minutes, the only sound in the chamber was his voice and the low hum of the translator nodes. Then one of the 12 spoke, the third voice, Ad, lower in the ranks. His robe was a shade between red and the color of water in the evening. The color of his skin was active, changing slowly, which meant he was actually thinking, not displaying the stillness that power demanded. He asked about resource exchange structures among humans. Did the surplus models described by Ilya actually function at the stated scale? Or were these political promises disguised as logistics? It was a real question, technical, precise, from someone who had read the proposal and perceived it as a real thing. Something in Ilya's chest relaxed, a tightness that had been there for 3 years, the tightness of not knowing. Is there anyone on the other side of the door? He answered completely, with examples, with numbers. The question was, Ad. Ilya answered that too. Across the chamber, the color of the first voice remained very still. What happened next happened quickly. It was the detail that remained, not the act itself, but its speed. A complete lack of ceremony, no announcement, no formal accusation. The guard simply stepped forward, the way humans step forward to complete a task that had already been decided elsewhere by someone who didn't think the room needed to know in advance. Ilya had time for one thought. Not a useful thought, not a brave one, just 3 exits. The translator earpiece kept working. It was still warm against his ear, still performing its job with full mechanical precision, feeding him words in a language he had spent 3 years studying because he believed, truly believed, that learning someone's language was the first act of peace, that it was what made the door open. The earpiece informed him that the Keti guards were reciting a formal phrase about the completion of service. It informed him that the weather on Keti Prime was expected to be clear for the next 4 cycles. It informed him that the third voice, Ad, had risen from his seat. The translation of the formal pose was something between objection and grief, but the color of the first voice had turned pure white, the color of finality, of something already done, and no one was going to say anything in this light. The earpiece kept feeding him words. The earpiece didn't know when to stop. The transmission antenna in the chamber was active. Ilya knew this because he had read the technical specifications of Keti transmission technology. Just as he prepared for everything, read everything, learned everything, because he never stopped believing that more knowledge was the same as more goodness. The signal went out on a standard frequency, the one every being with a receiver was tuned to, because it had been announced 3 days ago that there would be an important diplomatic development. Every species with a receiver received the same broadcast, including humanity. The earpiece kept feeding him words until the signal was cut. The last thing it translated was an announcement about scheduled maintenance, about pressure regulation in the Northeast Corridor, the one that isn't monitored after 2. Back on Earth, in 11 different time zones, in government offices, command centers, and ordinary living rooms, people watched the broadcast on screens of varying size and quality, with varying levels of understanding of exactly what they were seeing. In the kitchen, where the smell of burnt toast had never aired out, and the mug of cold coffee had been sitting on the table for 6 weeks, covered in a thin film, the kind of film that means something has been waiting for a long time, a notification appeared on the small screen by the window. No one was there to see it. Mark was already at his desk on Station Titan, in the narrow space between the arrival of the notification and the first call. The space where a person sits with a sheet of paper crossed by the shape of everything, and the world hasn't caught up to the new shape yet. He sat in that space for 4 minutes. Then he picked up the paper, placed it parallel to the edge of the table, and hit the comms. Get me the last 90 days of Keti territorial movement. His voice was the same steady weight-bearing register. There was nothing in it that a person could point to and say, there, that's the moment. That's where everything changed. But Iwan, who had served under General Mark Voss for 6 years and had never been afraid of him, stood in the doorway with the notification still in hand. Now he was afraid, not of Mark, but of who Mark had become. In 4 minutes alone, with a sheet of paper and a decision that the rest of the galaxy didn't know about yet, the rest of the galaxy would know. The notification had arrived at 3:40 station time, which meant that you, Iwan, had been awake for 22 hours, with 6 more to go before anything resembling sleep became possible. He read it on his screen, read it again, sat very quietly for a moment, like a man whose brain is occupied with something complex and needs the body to stop moving while it works. Then he printed it on paper, an old habit from his training days. Some information cannot be kept on a screen. It has to be put somewhere. Some information must be in the hand. He went to the general's office. The door was open. As always, when Mark worked late, which was almost every night, which meant that the open door was not a signal of anything other than that Mark Voss was a man who didn't close doors if there was no need. Iwan had figured out in his 6 years of work that this was because closing a door takes half a second, and Mark had long since totaled up all those half seconds of his life and redistributed them to something else. He still knocked on the door frame. Mark looked up from the star charts on his desk. The maps were spread from edge to edge. Maps of the outer ring borders, overlays of supply lines, the kind of documents that meant Mark was working on 3 problems ahead of the current official problem. His eyes moved first to Iwan's face, then to the paper in Iwan's hand. Something in the paper. The very fact that it was paper. Mark understood before Iwan said a word. Iwan crossed the room, placed the notification on the table, and stepped back 2 paces, which was not the standard military distance. It was the distance a person steps back from something they feel is radiating heat. Mark picked up the paper, read it once, laid it face up, parallel to the edge of the table. He didn't speak. However, it was quiet in the office, save for the low mechanical breathing of the station's life support system. Somewhere in the corridor outside, a night shift technician walked by. His boots needed new soles. The sound appeared and disappeared. Mark looked at the notification on his table. His face expressed nothing. Not a look of shock, not emptiness, not a frozen stare, but the expression of a man who had already performed the calculations very quickly and very deeply and had arrived at an answer. And the answer had locked everything external in place while the internal began its work. Iwan had served in 3 combat deployments before he came to serve under Mark Voss. He had seen men go cold under pressure, how men explode, and how men go somewhere else entirely in their eyes, into some back corner where the real decisions happen. He recognized the third, and it had never scared him before. Mark reached out and picked up the cold coffee mug from the corner of his desk, the one that had been there since Ilya left. He turned it in his hands. A slow, uniform rotation, the way you might turn an interesting rock you found. Then he set it back down. "Get me the last 90 days of Keti territorial movement," he said. "Yes, sir," Iwan replied. He left. He got the data. When he returned, Mark was already standing at the wall display. Hands behind his back, body weight distributed in a way that meant he would be there for a long time and didn't need a chair for it. The calls came in until 5:00. First, the General Secretary of the United Earth Assembly, then the Joint Chiefs of Staff, then the Director of Diplomatic Affairs for the UEA, who was sobbing into the receiver, which was the most honest reaction offered by anyone. Then 2 separate calls from representatives of the Varai Collective, a neutral civilization that had watched the broadcast, just like everyone else, who wanted it officially noted on the record that they were deeply saddened and had absolutely no idea about the Keti's actions. Iwan logged every call. The list grew to 14. Mark didn't take a single one. He stood at the wall display and studied the Keti territorial movement data and didn't take a single call. And Iwan, who was a practical man from a practical city, who believed in process, the chain of command, and the right way, never once suggested that perhaps the general should take a call, because Iwan saw Mark's face when he read the notifications, and he knew that whatever was happening inside that stillness, adding the general secretary's voice to it, would not help the general secretary. By the second day, Mark hadn't slept. That wasn't unusual. Mark hadn't slept for 4 days during the Kepler Corridor campaign. The one military history circles called the 16-hour war, though it actually lasted 11 days, and the 16 hours referred only to the final push designed by Mark in a field tent with 2 broken ribs and a headache he treated by drinking water and refusing to acknowledge it. Yuan knew the story because he was there. Mark ate at his desk, he drew maps, he cross-checked. He pulled intelligence files that technically exceeded his operational clearance. And no one said anything, because no one was willing to be the one to tell Mark Voss that his access was restricted. Not that week, he pulled Ilya's full diplomatic file. 9 attempts to establish formal contact with the Keti Dominion. All rejected, ignored, or simply returned unopened. Ilya's proposal, the frameworks for resource exchange, models for corridor demilitarization pages and pages of work that represented 3 years of a man who was very good at his job, doing his job as well as possible. Mark read all of it once, carefully, the way one reads military intelligence not for the sensations, but for the structure, for what is there and what isn't, for what the documents revealed about the shape of the thing they described. And he read Ilya's proposal, and he read the Keti territorial movement, and then he sat at his desk for a long time with both sets of documents before him, hands flat on the table's surface, eyes moving between them. Then he began to write. On the 5th day, Yuan was called into the office for a briefing. It lasted 40 minutes. Mark stood at the display the whole time and never once looked at his notes because there were no notes. Everything was in his head, structured, sequential, and complete. He talked about supply routes, logistical bottlenecks, and orbital approach vectors, and about 17 specific infrastructure installations and why each one was important, and in what order, and with what precision. He talked about warning windows, how much warning each target needed before the strike to guarantee civilian evacuation. He calculated them individually. Each was different. Each was calibrated to the specific population, density, and capacity of the exit paths of that installation. Yuan wrote as fast as he could. His handwriting, usually small and precise, blurred across the page and lost its angles. Not because the information was complex, but because he realized what he was hearing. Because he was watching a man take 3 years of his brother's diplomatic proposals and translate them into another language. The only language the Keti had ever demonstrated a willingness to listen to. When Mark stopped speaking, the room was very quiet. Yuan looked at his notes, then at Mark. "Sir," he said, "this will cost. The assembly will want to be consulted." "Yes. Will you consult them?" Mark looked at him. Yuan wrote something else on his tablet, something small in the margins. Later, he couldn't remember exactly what it was, only that having written it, he felt a little better, the way small. Certain actions make people feel a little better when a large and certain thing is too big to hold. "Get me Admiral Chin and General Park," Mark said, "and get me the broadcast frequency specifications of the Keti." "The broadcast frequency?" "Yes." Yuan looked up. "That's the frequency they use for I know what it's for." Ilya's last message arrived via diplomatic mail on the 6th day. It was found on the station before the Keti cleared the official records. It wasn't marked as urgent. It wasn't marked with anything. It was just a standard diplomatic packet, delayed by 3 weeks of routing delays and the usual bureaucratic slowness of objects moving in space. Yuan brought it to Mark personally. Inside was a folder with notes from Ilya's preparatory period, Keti speech models, breakdowns of the formal register, a draft of his opening speech, routine work, the kind that goes into the processor after a mission is finished. In the margins of the last page, in handwriting that was smaller and more compressed than the rest, the handwriting of a man writing something he hadn't planned to write was 1 line. 3 exits, northeast corridor, unmonitored after 2. Mark would have already used 2 of them. Mark read it once. He folded the paper along a clean crease, placed it in the left breast pocket of his uniform, and pressed his hand to the pocket for a moment. Not a gesture of grief, not a gesture of anything with a name, just a man making sure that something was where he had put it. He didn't take it out again. In the corner of his desk, the coffee mug was still standing where it had been for 6 days. A thin film on top, something waiting. Mark picked it up, carried it to the recycler by the door, dropped it in, and returned to his desk. The notification was still there, face up, parallel to the edge of the table. Mark picked it up too, read it one last time, though there was no need to read it. He had read it once, and since then it hadn't moved, and he just looked at it like a man who is about to put something away and needs a final moment with its weight in his hands. He folded it once, put it in the recycler along with the mug. He sat down, coughing. He opened the Keti star charts on his display, full territorial maps, every system, every installation, every supply route, marked with the clean geometric lines of Keti cartography. And he began to read them the way Ilya read briefing packets. Carefully, completely, every word, every mark in the margins, every small detail that other people missed because they didn't think small details mattered. Ilya always said that small details are where the door is. Mark read the maps until the morning of station time. He hadn't slept. He didn't need to. But now he was inside the problem, completely inside it. And the problem had a shape, and the shape had a solution. And the solution was not something the Keti High Council, sitting on their broadcast in their flat white confidence, could foresee. They had killed a man who believed in words. They didn't know that his brother believed in something more ancient and definitive. Not destruction, not anger, but a very simple and very destructive idea, that every problem has a right answer, and that finding it is just a matter of being willing to do the work. Mark was willing to do the work. He always was. Iwan arrived at 6 and found that the map was still glowing, and Mark was still reading, and 2 cold cups of coffee on the table that no one had touched. He picked one up, drank it cold, said nothing when he had been doing this long enough to know when to be silent. And when the room was already full, he sat at his station, opened his logs, and began to prepare the documents that needed to be prepared, because that was his job, and his job was what he had. Outside the station porthole, the stars sat where they always sat, patient and indifferent and very, very far away. The Keti Dominion was somewhere out there in that darkness, rooted in its confidence, reading its own silence as the end of the conversation. It was not the end of the conversation. Mark turned the page. The first strike happened on Tuesday. Not that Tuesday meant anything in deep space. Outside the ring, there were no Tuesdays, only station time and ship time and arbitrary numbers that humans overlaid on the dark so they wouldn't lose themselves. But the people on Earth marked the day. They marked a lot in the ensuing week, because they needed somewhere to put their hands while a larger event was occurring. And the details were something to hold on to. The target was Supply Station K7. A logistical hub in the disputed corridor zone, fuel reserves, maintenance equipment, automated freight processing, no weapons, no command staff. The installation's workforce consisted of 312 Keti civilians and a rotation of 62 logistical military personnel. The warning was delivered 38 minutes before the strike. An exact window, enough for everyone to leave, and short enough that no one could move military assets before it became important. The warning was delivered in Keti in the formal register, tonal layers. It read, "Evacuate. Hums. You have 38 minutes. This is not a mistake." They evacuated all 374 people. The last ship left the station's perimeter 4 minutes before the deadline. Then the station was no more. The second strike followed in 6 days, then the third, then the fourth and fifth within 1 week. A total of 17 installations in 3 months. Each supply station, fuel depot, logistical processing center. Each was warned, each emptied before the strike. Each was chosen with such precision that the Keti Military Command, viewing the pattern on their war tables, found it deeply strange when the strangeness was this. Mark wasn't striking because he caused pain. He was striking because it stopped. There is a difference between an army that wants to destroy you and an army that wants to make you unable to move. The first goes after your population centers, your government, your command structure. The second goes after your fuel, your supply chains, your ability to move your territorial border by 0.4 light-years per cycle, the Keti territorial expansion that moved with the slow, mechanical confidence of something that never interrupted, stopped. Not because they were losing ships, not because their army was weakened, but because they couldn't refuel what they had, couldn't supply what was deployed. They couldn't maintain the slow external pressure that had been the basis of their strategy. For 30 years they were a hand pushing against something that simply moved out of the way. The hand was still a hand, it just had nothing left to push against. On the other side of a very large stretch of space, in a small office on a station belonging to the Sinindat hegemony, a civilization that in recent years had found it convenient to supply certain Keti infrastructure contracts without making that information particularly public, an analyst named Vesa for Tornvis was having a bad month. She was an intelligence specialist. 19 years. She had a reputation in the narrow professional circle where such reputations exist for seeing patterns in data that other analysts missed. Not because she was smarter than them, though she was, but because she had a habit of asking a different question. Most analysts ask, "What is this data telling me?" Vesa 4 asks, "What is this data trying to do?" She isolated the pattern of strikes within 48 hours of the first one, mapped it, then mapped it again because the first map looked wrong, too neat, too well thought out, and she wanted to check her work. It wasn't wrong. She pulled the full diplomatic protocol of Mark Voss, the one the Keti had rejected without a formal answer 3 months before his execution. She read it fully, which wasn't standard procedure for analyzing military strikes, but which she did anyway, because Vesa 4 Tornvis never fully trusted standard procedure. She read the proposal. She read the map of the strikes. She put them side by side. The 17 installations that Mark had chosen to strike were exactly not approximately, not roughly exactly the 17 infrastructure systems that Mark Voss had asked the Keti to demilitarize as a condition of the proposed treaty. The resource corridors that Ilya had asked them to share were the corridors that Mark was now clearing, depriving the Keti of the ability to operate within them. Mark wasn't waging a war. He was building a treaty one destroyed installation at a time, in the exact order and configuration proposed by Ilya. He was constructing the outcome his brother had asked for in that chamber. Not asking for it, not negotiating, making it the only remaining form the situation could take. Vesa sat at her desk for a long time after she realized this. Very quietly, the way a person sits when their stillness isn't calmness, but concentration. The kind that arises when the brain works very fast on something that has taken it completely by surprise. She classified her analysis under maximum secrecy. The last line read, "The human general is not waging a war, he is waging an argument. I do not know who taught him this. I believe we should find out before we decide which side we will be on." She leaned back, looked at the ceiling of her office, which was a standard Synandot administrative gray-green and was completely uninteresting, which was fine, because she wasn't looking at it. She was thinking about the fact that her government had, for the last 4 years, been secretly supplying Keti infrastructure contracts, as governments do things they prefer not to be asked about directly. And she was thinking about the fact that she would have to write a second report, a different one, the one that goes to different people and carries a different weight. She didn't want to write it. She wrote it anyway. That was the kind of person she was. On Station Titan, Mark slept 4 hours a day, ate at his desk, spoke rarely. His command staff had developed a special sense of awareness over the weeks of the campaign. Not fear, certainly not tension, but a heightened alertness. The kind people developed in environments where a missed weak signal meant something important was missed. They looked at him like they look at a river, not because the river is a threat, but because the river knows where it is going, and you want to know before it arrives. When Mark spoke, people acted in seconds, not out of fear, but out of realization that he had already thought it through. And the instruction is the last step of a process that is already complete, and the fastest way to stay useful is to act when he says to act. Yuan managed the flow, calls, documents, intelligence summaries, a constant administrative machine of a military campaign working at a precise and controlled pace. He was good at it. He was good at it the same way Mark was good at strategy, not by working the hardest, but by understanding what the real work was, and not confusing it with other jobs that appeared nearby. When the real work was holding Mark's attention on the problem, and everything else away from Mark's attention, he did it without being asked. He stopped needing to be asked for most things a month ago. Late on the 31st day of the campaign, Iwan brought 2 cups of coffee into the command room and found Mark standing at the wall display with the blue-white light of the Keti star maps. Hands at his sides, eyes slowly moving across the diagrams, the same maps. For the 3rd night in a row, Iwan placed 1 cup next to Mark's right hand, left it there, stepped back. He had learned not to ask during map reading. The first time he asked, 2 weeks into the campaign, tired and curious in the small hours, Mark looked at him with an expression that wasn't unfriendly but clearly came from somewhere very far away, and said nothing. And Iwan realized that some things would not be explained. Whether one should worry about this was his problem, which he had to solve, not Mark's. He decided not to worry about it. He drank his coffee, set the cup down quietly. On the wall display, the Keti Dominion stretched for 40 light years in clean geometric lines. Systems, stations, supply routes, the entire infrastructure of a civilization that had decided other civilizations were problems to be managed and had built itself accordingly. 14 of the 17 installations were already gone. Warned, evacuated, destroyed. 3 remained. Mark raised his hand and touched the display. Not a tactical gesture, not pointing at a target. Just a fingertip touching the surface, touching the light of a specific system not far from the Keti territorial border. A system in the center of the demilitarized zone Ilya had proposed. A system Ilya had called, in his proposal, the beginning of a possible common future. Mark lowered his hand. 3 left, he said. Neither to Iwan nor to anyone. Just a fact, spoken into the room. Iwan said nothing. Mark turned away from the display, sat down, opened a different set of documents, this time not maps, but dense legal text that made Iwan's eyes blur after 10 minutes just looking at it. He read it with the same complete attention he gave the maps. Iwan recognized the documents the moment they were Ilya's treaty proposal. Not a summary, not a briefing version, but the full draft. 73 pages of specific, carefully designed frameworks that 3 years of work had built into a single, steady white solution that had never bothered to read. Mark read it as he read everything, taking his time completely, not jumping to the conclusion. Page after page, the way you read something when you intend to know it, not just know about it. Outside the station, in the darkness between the stars, the 3 remaining installations sat unaware. Keti logistics teams went about their work. Fuel circulated through pipes. Cargo moved along automated paths. The routine work of a civilization that a month ago was completely confident that the period at the end of humanity's sentence had been placed. When the period turned out to be a comma, the next word was being prepared. Mark turned the page. The Keti High Council requested a truce on the 47th day. They sent the request through 3 separate channels. Standard Keti diplomatic frequency, an alternative channel through a neutral comms node in ear, and a direct message addressed to the United Earth Assembly, which carefully did not mention Mark Voss by name or rank. The last detail was noted by everyone who read it and commented on by no one, because everyone who read it understood what the omission meant. The Keti High Council, in its recorded history, did not address a military opponent directly. To do so would mean classifying the opponent as an equal. They weren't ready for that. However, they were ready to stop losing fuel depots. The truce request asked for a 40-day pause in hostilities for the resumption of formal diplomatic negotiations. It referenced in careful language the established protocols for intercivilizational conflict resolution. It was correctly formatted, procedurally precise. The work of a government that understood the mechanics of diplomacy even when it had chosen not to use them for 30 years. Mark read it, handed it to Iwan without words. Iwan asked if there would be an answer. Mark said, "Tell them we will talk when the last 3 installations are settled." Iwan said, "Sir, the Assembly will tell them that." Iwan told them. The Assembly's response came in 4 hours and took significantly longer than 4 hours to process fully because it arrived in 7 separate messages from 5 different departments and contained 42 requests for consultation, 18 expressions of concern, and 1 insistent note from the General Secretary, which you read, summarized into 1 sentence, and then didn't read to Mark, because 1 sentence meant the General Secretary was unhappy, and Mark already knew that. The truce request was rejected. The Keti tried another approach on the 53rd day. They sent the 3rd voice. Not through official channels, not with the official bureaucratic weight of a council decision. A direct personal transmission, addressed correctly, specifically to General Mark Voss of the United Earth Assembly Armed Forces. It arrived at 2:30 station time. Iwan was awake. He was always awake at 2:30. He had stopped fighting at about 3 weeks into the campaign and had started keeping a spare uniform at his station, because there was no point in going back to his apartment if he had to be back in 4 hours. He marked the transmission as priority, brought it to Mark. Mark read it. Had written in Keti in the formal register, tonal layers, with a human translation beneath it. The translation was technically accurate but slightly flat, as machine translation always is, losing the weight of multi-layered meaning beneath the surface. Mark read both versions. First the Keti, then the translation, and then back to the Keti. "Oh, I asked your brother a question," Ad wrote. "He answered it completely and without hesitation. He treated my question as if it deserved an answer, which no human envoy had before, and no Keti voice had expected. I have often thought of it in the weeks since. I am writing to you because I believe he would have wanted someone to keep asking. I would like to ask you a question, if you will allow." Mark set the transmission aside. He sat with it for a long time. so long that Iwan, who was trying very hard to be not present, not absent as he had learned was how to be most useful, quietly filled both coffee mugs and returned to his corner. Then Mark picked up his notepad for answers. He wrote 4 words in standard English script without translation. He answers questions. I do not. He handed it back to Iwan. Iwan sent it. He didn't ask if Mark was sure. He had learned over the weeks of the campaign and the years before it that Mark Voss was always sure. The question was never whether he was sure. The question was whether this was the right form of certainty for the situation. And that was a question Iwan had stopped being sure he could answer. On the 59th day, the galactic community began to realign. It did so the way galactic communities always realign quietly, in small, incremental steps, each of which was individually defensible, and collectively meant that everyone was deciding where the wind was blowing and turning to face it. The Synandat hegemony, whose supply contracts with the Keti Dominion had been detailed in the second Vesa 4 Tornvis report that had leaked through alternative channels with the reliability of things that are supposed to leak, reshuffled its diplomatic corps. 3 high-ranking officials resigned. 2 new ones appeared in their places. The hegemony issued a statement expressing its commitment to intra-civilizational stability and its long-standing support for fair framework structures. The statement didn't mention the Keti. It didn't mention humanity. It didn't mention the word contracts or the word sorry. 3 smaller civilizations that had been conducting preliminary alliance negotiations with the Keti Dominion discovered around the same time that their schedules were filled. Conflicting obligations, unfortunate timing, perhaps in the next cycle. And the Varai Collective, the civilization that had watched Ilya's death on live broadcast and had released a note of condolence, released a second statement the next morning. It was longer. It used phrases like demonstrated restraint, consistent with established norms of proportional response, and willingness to facilitate constructive dialogue between the parties. It noted that the Varai had maintained a position of principled neutrality throughout the current conflict, and that this neutrality had given them a clear view of the situation's development. It ended with an expression that the Varai were ready to support frameworks for a lasting peace. That was diplomatic language for, we want to be friends with whoever is still standing. Mark received the Varai communique at 14 on the 61st day. He read it. Iwan passed it to Iwan. Archive it, he said. Under what heading, sir? Mark looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not in contemplation. He had already thought enough, with the patience you have for things that are inevitable but still a bit tiresome. Too late to matter. Too useful to ignore. Iwan wrote this on the file label verbatim. He had stopped editing Mark's words weeks ago. The 63rd day brought the 16th installation. The same procedure. Warning issued. Specific window. Personnel evacuated. All 240 people, including the repair crew that was conducting emergency repairs. And they needed 6 extra minutes. And they got them, because Mark had included 6 extra minutes in the window while the installation was destroyed. Before the local command could react with anything other than traffic on channels, Mark's team was monitoring, and Iwan logged the 16th. And 1 strike remained. Vesa 4 Tornvis hadn't slept well. That wasn't unusual for her. During active situations, she had a brain that treated problems like toys to chew on, and found it difficult to put them away even in the dark hours when the office was empty. And the displays were in standby mode, and technically there was nothing to do. But the current situation kept her awake in a different way, not because she couldn't solve the problem, because she had. She saw what Mark was doing within the first 2 weeks. She wrote it down. She watched it unfold with a special sense of watching a correctly written proof being demonstrated in practice. A feeling that was part satisfaction, part something much more uncomfortable that she struggled to name, that she couldn't stop thinking about in the dark of her quarters at 3 station time. This was the point she couldn't analyze. The warning transmissions. Mark's team was sending warnings to the Keti in the formal register, tonal layers. The kind of Keti that required serious study for correct production. Not just vocabulary, but multi-layered structures of meaning, the architecture of communication that took years to study. She conducted a linguistic analysis of the transmissions, comparing them with a linguistic analysis of Ilya Voss's official messages from his 3 years as Earth's diplomatic envoy. The same register, the same approach to layering, the same specific construction decisions in the structure of the formal greeting. Mark Voss had learned to speak to the Keti just as his brother had spoken to them. Not to negotiate, not to ask, but simply in the warnings, in the part that read, Leave, you have time. This is not a mistake. In that part, he spoke with the voice his brother had built his whole career on. Vesa was a person who believed in the accuracy of what things meant. She sat with this specific thing for several nights before she became accurate enough about it. What did it mean? Mark Voss didn't separate war from diplomacy. He waged them as a single operation. Each strike was the military half of an argument, and each warning was the diplomatic half. And the argument was the same argument Ilya had made in that chamber. And the language was the same language. And the only difference was that this time, no one could choose not to listen. She wrote it down. Third report. Personal file. Not official, just for herself, because she was a person who needed to write things down to fully understand them. She wrote, "He finished his brother's sentence. He just used different grammar." She reread it. She left it as it was. Late at night, on the 71st day of the campaign, Yuan found Mark standing at the observation port in an empty briefing room next to the command center. This time, not star maps, but the port itself. A real physical port. He was looking out into the real, physical, dark space at the stars, sitting motionless in the distance, and at the Keti territorial border somewhere beyond the reach of sight. Yuan stood in the doorway. After a moment, Mark said, "He always said there was a next word." Yuan said nothing when the conversation quieted, when the other side stopped answering. He said that silence is not a wall. He said it's just a word you haven't found yet. The station breathed somewhere deep in the infrastructure. Something cycled and quieted again. One installation left, Mark said. Neither to Yuan, nor to anyone, just a fact. The weight of where they were in the shape of things. Yuan looked at his general's face in the dim light of the observation port and saw something there he hadn't seen for 71 days of the campaign. Not grief, not fatigue, but the specific expression of a man who is almost at the end of a very long walk and finally sees what he was heading toward. He left Mark at the port, took 2 cups of coffee from the dispenser in the quarters, returned, placed one on the table by the port where Mark could take it if he wanted. He sat in the chair in the corner, out of the light. He waited. That was his job. That had always been his job. And after 71 days of watching Mark Voss work, he had come to understand that this work was not small, that a person who holds the space around a man carrying something huge is also carrying something huge, just of a different kind. And both these things needed to be carried to the end. He waited. Outside the port, the stars sat where they always sat. Darkness. The installation was still there, but not for long. The 17th installation was warned in a 60 to 90-minute window, the longest Mark had given. There were 240 people on the facility, including a team conducting deep repairs on the lower levels of the object, and they required extra time for a detour to get to the emergency transport bays. Mark knew about the repair team. He built 90 minutes around them. They all got out. Then it was gone. The Keti High Council's reaction came in 4 hours. One line, without tonal layers, without a formal register. Just flat, practical Keti from people who had run out of a different kind. "We will discuss terms," Mark read. He placed it parallel to the edge of the table, looked at Yuan. "Tell them we will come to them," he said. "Standard diplomatic transport. 3 days." Yuan sent it. The response came in 40 minutes. Agreed. He waited for Mark to say something else. Mark had already returned to the documents on his desk. Not star maps, not intelligence files, the treaty proposal. Ilya's 73 pages, which Mark had fully read at least 4 times during the campaign, and which were now covered with small, precise notes in the margins in handwriting that wasn't Ilya's, but which over the weeks had acquired a similar quality. "Neat. Complete. Nothing else, sir," Yuan said. "The Assembly will want to send a diplomatic team. Standard procedure for surrender ceremonies. I know what standard procedure is. You will go yourself." This was not a question. Yuan had learned many weeks ago that asking Mark Voss questions he already knew the answer to was a way to fill space that silence made better. "Get me transport," Mark said. "Yes, sir." Yuan paused. "Do you want me to go with you?" Mark looked up. It was a short glance, the kind he threw when something surprised him slightly. Not the emotion of surprise, but the quick recalibration of a man who hadn't expected the question and was now quickly evaluating it. "Yes," he said. Yuan nodded. He went to arrange transport. Dear, he didn't say he was glad or that it was important to him, or all the things that were true and that neither of them was going to say. He just went and did the next thing. That was how they worked. The Keti negotiation station was not the station adjacent to Keti Prime. It was a smaller, secondary structure in the disputed corridor zone. Chosen, Mark suspected, because it was neutral territory in the sense that both sides had recently done things nearby that neither side preferred to do on their own home territory. They docked at 14 station time. Mark and Yuan and 2 officers who were there for documentation, and both understood that their job was to be as quiet and present as the furniture. The Keti met them at the docking bay, not guards, but protocol officers, a formal distinction that mattered. Protocol officers meant they viewed this as a diplomatic event. Mark noted it without comment. They walked through corridors that differed from those Ilya had described in his briefing notes. Dimmer lighting, quieter. The slow, rhythmic pulsing of the panels was at a different frequency. Not the background rest of Keti Prime, but something slightly faster. An elevated register, the biological equivalent of a room that knows its meeting with its recipient matters. The negotiation chamber was smaller than Ilya's execution chamber. Rectangular table, 4 chairs on each side. No raised rows, no architecture of dominance. Either the Keti built this room specifically for this purpose, or chose it specifically because it didn't look like a place where power had sat before. Mark sat opposite the first voice. Dratvin, 5 members of the council. He sat still the way he always sat still, not displaying it, not achieving it, just an absence of anything that would require it. 3 of the Keti officials later described him separately as unreadable, in a way that in itself was a kind of message, which was the closest any of them came to articulating what it was like to be in a room with Mark Voss at the end of a very long argument. At the far end of the table, the third voice, Arid, sat in the last chair. He looked at Mark from the moment he entered, not with hostility, but with the special attention of a person who had thought about someone for a long time and was now measuring reality against the idea. In the room, it was quiet. Arid spoke first. Formal register. Correct Keti layering, meaning you treat something as if it deserves care. He said, "Your brother believed we were capable of more." Mark looked at him. A long, steady look. "He was right," Mark said. Pause. The room held it. "That is why we are at this table, and not at the wreckage." Formalizing the terms took 4 hours. Mark didn't negotiate. He presented them. There is a difference. Negotiations imply the possibility of adjustment, and the terms Mark presented weren't adjustable, just as the current geometry of the room wasn't adjustable. These were the terms, because these were the terms, and the shape of the last 3 months had made them the only remaining terms, and the Keti High Council, going through the formal process with the practical exhaustion of people who had been outplayed 17 times by the same argument, signed where they were asked to sign. Demilitarization of 17 corridor systems. Ilya's first request. Framework for resource exchange for the disputed zone. Ilya's second request. A war crimes tribunal for the execution, consisting solely of Keti judges. Mark didn't ask for human participation in this. He only asked that it happen, and that the protocol be complete, and that the Keti do it themselves. Because justice coming from the outside is a performance, and justice coming from within is retribution. And Mark wanted retribution. And one sentence that wasn't in Ilya's proposal, that wasn't in any draft, in any preliminary document, in any protocol, written in Mark's hand on the back of a transmission printout somewhere around 3 a.m., which Yuan hadn't witnessed. The Keti secretary read it aloud as part of the official protocol. The translator node rendered it in flat, accurate, emotionless Keti. The Keti Dominion acknowledges that the United Earth Assembly requested formal dialogue 9 times before the commencement of hostilities. The protocol will reflect that humanity requested first. No one argued with the point. Not because they agreed with it, although the color change of Arid suggested he might have, but because they were not in a position to argue about anything at this stage of the proceedings, and they knew it. And Mark knew that they knew, and none of this needed to be said. The pen moved across the paper. It was quiet in the room. Mark reached into the left breast pocket of his uniform. He had reached into that pocket hundreds of times in the last 3 months, checking, confirming a small, unconscious gesture, making sure that something was still where he had put it. He didn't take it out again. He took it out now. Ilya's translator earpiece. Small, gray, ordinary-looking, a device that came in a standard diplomatic kit and wasn't particularly remarkable, except for the specific way it continued to perform its job with full mechanical precision after everything else stopped. He placed it on the table in the center between himself and the first voice. He didn't look at it. He didn't explain it. He didn't look at Arid, although he was looking at him with the expression of a man who had read enough human briefings to exactly understand what he was seeing. Mark had already stood up. Yuan gathered the documents. The two officers gathered their things. The protocol formalities were performed in the appropriate language. They returned to the docking bay. Mark didn't look back. The terms of the treaty were sent out in a packet on the standard broadcast frequency, the same one they used for the execution. Every being with a receiver received the same broadcast, just as they had received the same broadcast 3 months ago when the Keti used the frequency to send a message about what humanity's proposal looked like with a period at the end. This time, they read the terms, demilitarization of the corridor, framework for resource exchange, the tribunal clause, one of the handwritten editions about the 9 requests for dialogue. In offices, command centers, and ordinary rooms 40 light-years away, people read the broadcast and decided what it meant. On the station of the Synandat hegemony, Vesa 4 Tornvis read the terms at her desk. She read them twice. She read the handwritten point 3 times. She opened her personal journal. Not an official report, not an analytical document with a secrecy level, just the journal she kept because she was a person who always believed some things needed to be written down just so they would be true, as they deserved to be true. She wrote, "Humanity sent a man who believed in words. Then they sent a man who knew what words were worth. The scary part, the thing I will think about for a long time, is that they were waging the same argument. They always intended to build a table. They just needed someone who would teach the rest of us what that table cost." She reread it. She left it as it was. She closed the journal, opened her official file, began to write the 3rd report, the one her government was waiting for, the one about what position the Synandat hegemony should take in the current post-conflict period. She wrote it carefully, honestly. She named the supply contracts. She named the failure. She named the correction that was required. It was an uncomfortable report. It wouldn't make her popular in certain offices. She filed it anyway. That was the kind of person she was. The ship carrying Mark and Ayuan back to Earth had a standard transit time of 11 days, which meant 11 days of operational readiness. Not a pause of peace, but a different quality of silence that comes when active work is finished and the machine of consequences hasn't fully launched. Yuan dealt with the correspondence. There was a lot of it. The General Secretary, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Varai Collective, which sent 3 separate messages, each warmer than the previous one, as if heat applied in sufficient quantity would retroactively change the note of condolence. Several alien diplomats whose civilizations weren't involved in the conflict but who had watched with the focused attention of people making notes for future use. He dealt with all of it. He kept Mark's space free, just as he had kept it free for 3 months. And he felt, in a way he didn't expect to feel, that the 11 days of transit were something he needed as much as Mark did. A threshold. A space between what had happened and everything that would come next. On the 4th day of transit, he brought 2 cups of coffee into the small common room adjacent to the command space and found Mark sitting at the table with the Keti star maps in front of him. The same maps. Yuan sat opposite him. He placed the cup next to Mark's right hand, cupped his own cup with both hands. He looked at the maps. He looked at Mark. "What are you looking for?" he asked. He said it the way people say something they haven't said for a long time. Not demandingly, but simply finally. Mark looked at the maps for another moment. Then he folded them once along a clean crease, set them aside. "Nothing," he said. Yuan waited. Found it. Yuan drank his coffee. It was cold. He had long since stopped noticing. Beyond the ship's hull, the stars sat in their fixed positions, patient and motionless, just as they sat while Ilya learned their language and while Mark learned their distance, just as they would sit long after all this ended. Mark didn't reach for his coffee. He looked at the stars through the porthole. He was silent for a long time. Not the working silence of a campaign, dense, directed silence of a man ahead of the situation by 3 problems. Just silence of a different kind. And the kind of silence that happens when you have been going somewhere for a very long time and finally arrive. And arrival is harder than the journey, as arrival always is. Yuan didn't speak. He had learned everything that needed to be learned about when not to speak. On the 8th night, Mark slept 8 hours without interruption. His body did it as if it had been waiting patiently and confidently for the moment when the work would be finished enough to allow it. Yuan checked on him once, left, returned to his station for correspondence, for the long administrative work of the consequences, which wasn't glamorous work, but which was necessary work, and which he performed with the same care he gave everything else. Well, because that was who he was, and because Mark had built something, and who was meant to help support it while the Earth around it settled. 3 days before Earth, Iwan filed the last major report, closed the logs of the active campaign, prepared the official documentation that would go to the Assembly, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Historical Archive. He stopped at the classification fields, looked at the empty line for the campaign's operational name. He thought about it for a long time. He typed Elias. He sent it.